Welcome to Solutions with Courtney Anderson. I am Courtney Anderson, and this is episode 208. This is our 208th episode of this show. And as always, I ask you to stop by CourtneyAnderson.com. That is our main website, and it is a library of resources for you. So you will find all 208 episodes of these shows. We've got individual show pages so that you can go and see more show notes, expanded links. Please do so. Here today in episode 208, we have a show that's part of the Myth Warriors series. The Myth Warriors series is exactly what it sounds like. We, you and I, we're warriors. Yes, we are. And we're ready for battle. So we have our offensive weaponry. We have our defensive protection. And we are geared up and ready to fight. Who are we fighting? What are we doing? Well, we're fighting myths. Because we cannot have the life that we intend. We will not be able to surpass our goals when we don't have good data, when we don't know what's really going on. So we got to be able to figure out what's a myth or a fabrication, a lie, a falsehood, a fallacy, so we can discard that, clear it out of our way. Because we're like we said, we're in battle. And we're fighting for the life that we intend. We're fighting to surpass our goals. So we got to be able to understand what's happening so that we don't, again, make these really poor decisions that take us away from where we intend to go and move us further away from our goals. So in our Myth Warriors series, today's topic is one that I'm enthralled by. So our show topic today is your employer isn't responsible for your happiness. Your employer is not responsible for your happiness. So that's our topic. And what we're going to do is attack this, because again, we're warriors. We're going to attack this concept, and we're going to ask, is this a myth? Is it a falsehood, a lie, a fallacy, so that we can discard it, not have it cloud up our thought process and decision-making process? Or is this something that's absolutely accurate? Let's see. So the question is, our employer, is not responsible for our happiness. Is this true, or is it a myth? Meaning, is it false? It's true. It's true. This is not a myth. This is not a myth. This is not a falsehood. This is not a lie. This is not a fallacy. This is accurate. It's true. Your employer, my employer, our employer is not responsible. Isn't responsible for our happiness. It's true. Now, many people, when we have these types of discussions, concur with my assertion. And when we share knowledge, people will give different input. There's a lot of data and research that will support my assertion that we internally are the predominant influence on our individual happiness, and that external individuals or entities, so the entity could be an organization, it could be a society, it could be a government, it could be a social club, it could be an employer, it could be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, an enemy. It could be anyone or anything. Maybe it's a pet. Maybe it's an inanimate object. Maybe it's our refrigerator. Maybe it's the washing machine. So the question is it internal? And that's where we should have our focus for attribution of our happiness, or is it external? And if you haven't checked out, or you haven't checked out in a while, some of the shows we've done where we've asked other questions related to this central point about who or what is pulling the strings in our life in terms of our happiness. So specifically, I would encourage you to either visit or revisit the show we did. It was episode 202. Episode 202 was talking about whether or not we can make another person happy. So whether we, external to someone else, can make them happy. Could I make my parent happy? Could I make my grandmother happy? Could I make my best friend happy? Could I make my wife or my husband happy? Could I make my child happy? Could I make my neighbor happy? And again, revisit it, but the conclusion I put forward in that program was that no, we cannot make another person happy. Now, it's interesting, and in that show, sometimes when we look at this issue, I've had people when I've given speeches say who don't agree, who do not concur with this analysis and this conclusion. They'll say I would say yes. The response is, the conclusion is that you cannot make another person happy. That's accurate. And then people would say, well, maybe you can't make another person happy, but you can make them unhappy. And then I'll hear things where people say, I know my spouse makes me unhappy, or my kids make me unhappy, or this boss makes me unhappy, or traffic makes me unhappy, or my salary makes me unhappy, or whatever. Okay. And then sometimes, because people are intending that to be a joke, I assume, then they laugh like it's funny, right? Like, oh, maybe they can't make me happy, but they sure make me unhappy, right? That spouse or child or parent or neighbor or boss or salary or broken car or, okay, look. The thing that I really was fascinated about in our show today was going beyond this first part of our analysis. The first part of our analysis is whether or not it's accurate, that it's a myth that our employer is not responsible for our happiness. And we're saying it's not a myth. But the thing that really fascinates me, like I said, that I was really anticipating with a little bit of, I'm tingling, my skin tingles. I'm so excited, and I have so much anticipation inside. The question that I'm really curious about is why do people want this? Why do people want this to be a myth? Why do people want to be able to say, you know what, my employer is responsible for my happiness? Why do people want that? Why does the person, like I said earlier, who makes, sort of I guess they're supposed to be jokes, but they're cruel. It's a public space when we're doing corporate education or I'm doing a keynote speech. And so it's somebody that's in front of hundreds or thousands of people making this joke and implying that their family member or spouse or child or boss or whatever is some horrible entity that literally makes them unhappy. I mean, that's hurts. I don't even know whoever it is they're referring to in most instances, because like I said, I'm traveling around the world doing these events, but I just thought, wow, if they heard that, really? And even if it was intended to be a joke, which is what people often say, I was just joking. Okay, well, I don't think it's funny. For many of the reasons I just said, that if the person heard that, like, where's the funny part? That you just said in front of hundreds and thousands of people. Many of whom do know this person because they're your coworkers. So what I'm really, like I said, I'm tingling with anticipation for us to move through in this program a little bit is examining why people want it to be true. Why people want to believe that somebody else is responsible. My employer, people want to believe, hey, my employer is responsible for my happiness. And if only my employer would give me a better schedule, make sure that I had a better chair, give me a better office, let me go telecommute, let me work more time so I can get overtime. Let me work a different schedule. Let me work the same schedule. Pay me more money. Give me more benefits. Give me more responsibility. Give me less responsibility. Provide more benefits. Provide less benefits. Give me more oversight. Give me less oversight. I mean, it's amazing. So the things that I'm saying that are just I'm just you know electrified by is one, why do you want this to be true? Why do you want this alternative analysis? Now, my analysis is that, look, this is not a myth. My argument is that this is accurate. It's accurate to say that your employer is not responsible for your happiness. Your employer is not responsible for your happiness. That's accurate. It is not a myth. But I'm asking in the alternative, why is it so popular? Why do people want this? Why do people want this to be a myth? Why do people want to argue the alternative argument and say, look, this is totally a myth. It's a lie to say, it's a falsehood to say that my employer isn't responsible for my happiness. My employer is responsible for my happiness. And again, then they go through these laundry lists. And as I said, one of the great beauties of my life has been that I've had the mobility to see many parts of our world that we share here on Earth. Of course, there's so many now, a minuscule percentage of the total, but I've been out and about in the world, and I continue to do so because I'd love to see as much as I can. And I'm grateful and appreciative of the wonder that I've been able to experience the beauty because I've had the mobility. So I've been able to physically, I've been able to mentally, I've been able to sensory absorb and experience these different parts of the world. And the thing that's interesting is how consistent we humans are. There are nuances, of course, and specific things we must be aware of and respect and defer to as we are out and about on our planet, and I'm sure beyond with our species. But there's a lot of consistency. And the thing that just has me electrified is, why do you want to believe? So I'm speaking not to you and I, or community members who might agree with the analysis that we put forward in so many other programs, right? That this is an internal issue. That if you want to attribute your happiness to some entity, it needs to be you. It needs to be internal. You need to perceive that you have an internal locus of control. And again, we've talked about this in so many different experiences and so many different settings, but it keeps underpinning and undermining all these different challenges and all these different issues and all the different types of solutions that we're exploring together. So here in our show today, I'm just wondering why someone wants the alternative to be accurate. Because let's walk through it. Let's do the logic. Okay, so let's say that we're taking this other alternative argument. The other alternative argument is to say, hey, this is a myth. It is a falsehood and a lie to say your employer isn't responsible for your happiness. That is a lie. It is a myth. And they would say that, so the truth is your employer is responsible for your happiness. Okay. If that was accurate, let's just go down that path. If your employer is responsible for your happiness, what options would you have in your life for happiness other than just random hoping and luck that you get an employer who decides? Because remember, if they're responsible for it, then that means they have control. They're in charge. So if my happiness and your happiness is predicated on this external entity, this employer, so it could be an individual that in our mind represents the employer. Maybe it's our manager, our supervisor, the CEO, the president of the organization, the general of our military organization, whatever. Okay, so whoever we individually view as representing that entity, the employer, or we may just view it as the collective. So many times it could be, hey, it's that government agency, it's that politician, it's that company, that it's that whatever, real estate company or university or sporting league or whatever it is, whatever the entity is, right? If it was accurate that they are responsible for our happiness, the employer is responsible for our happiness, that would mean that we have no responsibility. Now, you could argue that, well, maybe we both share some burden, right? So maybe we're both contributors to the happiness, but then we'll have to determine, I guess, in individual instances, what percentage of happiness responsibility we're going to allocate to which party. So maybe some people would say, hey, my employer is 80% responsible for my happiness, I'm 20%. And maybe someone else would say, hey, I'm 80% responsible, my employer is 20% responsible. Now, I make the argument, and what I said earlier is that your employer is not responsible at all. They are not responsible. So I'm saying that it's 0%. And some people would say the other end of the spectrum is it's 100%. Right? They'd say, hey, I am nothing but just a pawn in my employer's world. They move me like a piece on a chessboard. And if they want me to be happy, I'm happy. If my employer doesn't want me to be happy at all, I'm never happy. And that option. So let's say that somebody's on the 100%. They're in the 100% camp that, hey, it's not them at all, right? There's no way you can attribute any of their happiness to them individually. It is all about that employer. And I have met, as I said, around our beautiful planet, people who share this view and tell me often very assertively why they then don't agree with some of the policies and practices and tools and techniques that I share, because my advice is predicated on you having some input. If your employer is 100% responsible for your happiness, then again, there's nothing you could do other than just hope you get a better employer. Just sort of sit around and hope, think good thoughts, wish upon a star. Some people may have other superstitions. Some people have ethical frameworks. Some people may even have a spiritual focus where they will just hope to just hope for something better. Now let's take a moment though and think about this. My argument is that in the modern time period, when you and I right now, our community members, are sharing knowledge that now my employer isn't responsible for my happiness. Now, are there situations historically and even in modern times that are illegal where your employer may be responsible? Now, let's start with the historical issue. When we use employer, I mean someone who fits the definition of a legal employer. So in every part of our planet, there are a multitude of laws that will apply to help us understand what an employer is. And we have to clarify in our discussion that there would be, and there are instances where someone says that they're an employer, but they're really not. They don't meet the legal definition, right? Maybe they don't pay any wages. Maybe instead of it being a work-related contractual relationship, they have done things that prevent it from meeting that test. So for instance, let's say it's someone who says, oh, I'm an employer and this is my employee, and they're 4 years old. Okay. In many parts of the world, it's illegal for a 4-year-old to be an employee because they're a little child. If you have someone that you say is your employee and they're 4 years old, then my point is that doesn't meet the test of what I'm referring to as employer. That is a type of relationship where could a 4-year-old make the argument that their employer is responsible for their happiness, or the person or the entity they're calling their employer, because they're 4 years old and they're unable to do any of the things that adults are able to do at 4 years old. You in fact are still learning your own body to a large extent, and you're so early along in your human development, there's really not a lot you can do at 4 years old. Yeah, my point is that's not an employer. So when we talk about exploitation of child labor, as I said, in many parts of the world it is explicitly illegal. In other parts of the world it's implicitly not something that people approve of, and you can see why. It's a child. So if they're unable to have any bargaining power, and they're unable to go out on their own and say, well, if I don't like this job, I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'm going to go back to learn more skills in school, and many parts of the world they haven't even started school. So I'm not referring to something where someone is a little child. I'm not referring to something where someone is literally held in slavery, in bondage, either historically when it used to be legal in many parts of the world to do so, or current day where it's illegal, again, either explicitly or often implicitly by custom. People don't publicly go around talking about that they love being slave owners in modern times, even if that is something that they're doing, because again, it is not something that the international community endorses. So I'm not saying if somebody obviously has been kidnapped and held physically by force and is beaten and, starved and is a slave, then no, they don't. Of course, their employer has a huge amount, but that's not an actual employer because it's not an employee-employer relationship. Remember I said earlier, my anticipation was so excited, it was electrified. I mean, I see you can hear it in my voice how electric I am. And why am I saying this? These aren't tangents. What I'm trying to say and underscore and repeat and clarify is my point that if it's an actual legally recognized employer-employee relationship, that is the type of a vehicle that I'm referring to in this show topic. And in that situation, your employer isn't responsible for your happiness. Now, the reason that I've mentioned these other variables is because those are the types of things people will bring up, and they'll say, well, many times your employer really is. And then my point is, well, that's not a legal employer-employee relationship if you're talking about a very young minor child or a toddler or an infant. If you're talking about someone who's been kidnapped against their will and held in bondage and slavery, then obviously it's not an employer, that's your kidnapper, correct? A human trafficker is not an employer. And this is important because for our shared human experience, the majority of our time, these other alternative situations were the norm. In our recorded history and what our shared research, what anthropologists will tell us and try to interpret from finds that they'll make of ancient times, of interpretations of artwork, again, from ancient times. There were these situations where you weren't an employer-employee relationship. So, of course, they were responsible for your happiness. If you were, again, a young child, if you were kidnapped or taken in war, that was very common throughout our human history. You have a military conflict, and then whoever, quote, wins, then you just take whatever you want, obviously. Not just the land, but you would take whatever children, you take, women. And no, in that situation, then yeah. If you've been kidnapped, if you're a slave, if you're an indentured servant, if you were a serf, and your whole life, in a feudal system, you were tied to that estate, if you're a child, then no. That's not an employer-employee relationship. There's no freedom to contract. There's no ability to enter and exit those relationships. It was completely unilateral. So when we look through our shared human history, one of the things that we've seen in all parts of our world is a movement away from those times of antiquity and historical relationships where there was no freedom, to something that has many variables and nuances in different cultures and different political systems, but does move more toward the idea of the individual being able to enter and exit these relationships with an employer and to have some ability to have this idea of rights. That I went and I worked and now you have to pay me. Not, oh, I went and I worked and I'm a serf and this is my life and you never, this is it. This is what I do. I'll do this forever. Or I'm an indentured servant. I do this for X number of years or until whatever debt is allegedly paid off. Or I'm a slave. You don't ever pay me. In those situations, there's no agreement. There's nothing I can do to go rule of law and say, look, I've been over there. I did 75 hours of work this week for this entity, which I'll call an employer. Where's my compensation? You don't have any rights. That's why those systems are different systems. You're owned, or you're part of the estate. You're not an individual human. You do what they tell you. And that's the whole deal. That's why it's not a contract. And many systems in many parts of the world, to get around that there was no bargaining, the law recognized that the people in those situations weren't an individual that was equal to other individuals. So maybe they were, a fraction of a free person. 3/5 in the U.S. was recorded in their written documents at the founding time period of the nation. In other parts of the world, the idea was very clear. If someone was owned, then that's a category of entity that's separate from a person who's not owned. A person who was not owned could enter into work or could sell their goods if they chose to on the market. But if you were owned, then you weren't entering into a contract because you don't have the ability to do so because you're not an equal human. You're owned. You're property. And this was elaborately written and structured for exactly this reason, because they're not employer-employee. You're property. So if you said to me, hey, I'm property and I'm owned by another entity, my owner is responsible for my happiness, I will have a totally different analysis of that discussion. Because if you're owned by someone else, then we're not talking about an employer-employee relationship. We're talking about a relationship where you're not a human that's recognized as such with parity of other humans, including your owner. Your owner has the ability to come and go. You don't. You're property. So that's a different discussion. And I'm very, like I said, I'm electrified by this. And one of the things that when we were looking at this, I have to mention, because it just came to my mind just now, again, there was a very well, I believe, artistically well done film, 12 Years a Slave, and artistically, again, very well done film that if you haven't seen, and it's sort of won many international cinema and film awards. Now, I'll tell you the very candid truth, the subject matter of that film was very difficult for me to fully absorb. So what I often will do in situations where just I have emotional, I'm sort of overloading my emotional circuits, is I'll start to sort of shut things down so that I can sort of reprocess. So what I'm saying is that and when I watch a film that's very emotional for me, what I'll do is I will really start to tune out some of the information, because it's too much for me to process. So what I'll do is I'll close my eyes, because the visual elements, of course, especially something so artistically well done like that, it's too much for me. And I've done this my whole life. So when I was a young child, if you've ever seen the movie Bambi, which is an old Disney, I mean, literally decades and decades, but it's a classic. But it's sad. There's sad parts. So when the sad part, then I close my eyes, because for some reason, even though it's a cartoon, I know this. Look, I'm just telling, honest beyond any, because that's what this relationship is, right? We're collaborating together to help you surpass your goals so that we can do solution sets. And I'm just telling you that what I do when I'm overwhelmed is I just start trying to shut some of the data out. So if it's something like that where I'm watching, I'll just close my eyes. Sometimes if it's something I'm listening to, I'll just do something to just tune out that noise so I don't have to hear it, because it's too much. So back to 12 Years a Slave, even though I've experienced the whole film, I haven't experienced the total film, because a lot of it I just closed my eyes because it was so emotionally overwhelming. And even though it was from a different historical time period, honestly, I had nightmares where the fragment of a dream that I recall the best was that, because early in the film there's somebody who's free and just out and about living their regular life. This is my very simplified part. That part was the part that I had my eyes open for. The whole part was easy for me to pay attention and not. But then very early in the film, the person was hired, right, to go do some other work, but left their geographic region where they were. And at that historical time in the United States, when you moved different parts of the United States, the laws were drastically different. So the person goes to a different part of the U.S. for work, and for him, was taken into slavery. He was not a slave, but he ended up in a part of the world where it was possible, and was kidnapped, right? And then 12 years, right? So 12 years he's a slave, and then finally at the end, which is the part where I fully again could open my eyes. And throughout the movie, of course, I had my eyes open. It's just that it's a very, very emotional film if you haven't seen it. again, fantastic. But the nightmare I had was that the nightmare I recall, the parts I recall, were that I dreamed that I was out living my regular life, like walking around doing work, having a nice day, and then I was like kidnapped, right? And became a slave, and or didn't become a slave, but was kidnapped into slavery. Now, the reality is, does that happen in modern times? Are people today all around our globe trafficked? Yes, I know this. I absolutely do know this. I absolutely do know this, and we certainly have programs about this, and there's a lot of organizations doing fantastic work to bring attention to this issue and to stop it, to bring out penalties and international and domestic actors into this. So I'm aware of this. All I'm saying is that the nightmare and the fear that it sort of resonated with me was that would happen to me, and it was it's one of the most scary things I think that you and I and our community members could think about. People talk about what if a natural disaster happens, and those types of things. I think we all do understand because we've lived long enough that we've okay, and maybe we've experienced something. You were somewhere, oh my goodness, there's a tornado or a hurricane or a earthquake. So and we get it that's just something that could happen. I don't know how much we think about the fact that being taken from being a full human under the law, and kidnapped and being property and owned and abused. I don't know if we think about that obviously enough, because if we did, probably we'd have more of action to stop it. But when you think about it, when I thought about it, when I had the nightmares, it's just the most frightening thing. Because you might even think maybe a natural disaster happens, or sometimes we'll think, what if I was in an accident, a bicycle accident or car accident, or I lost a limb, or maybe I was in an accident and I was paralyzed. But that's not even as frightening as the idea of you as an entity not even existing as a person. And maybe, I hope not, that would not speak well to us as humans. Maybe that's part of why we haven't done enough to fully eradicate this behavior from our planet. I don't know. I do know that when you make the argument that you are not property, you're able to enter into relationships as an employee legally, and then you try to equate that these things are, we're here today in modern times. If it was just that I had been born in a different time period, I may have never had the opportunity. I may have never had the opportunity to be a full person. And when you think about that, and again, I think about just the fear, like watching a fictionalized artistic film did, in terms of fear and thinking, just even just thinking even in nightmares, what if that happened? I think that we do a disservice to all of the people that have made huge sacrifices to get us to a point where it's even an expected norm in many parts of the world that a human would have the chance to be individually free and not be property. And I think that is a gross disservice to our shared human history. And I also think it's a disservice to the opportunity that we do have, if we can be, and we are, legal employees in modern times. Because so many of our ancestors had no options to talk about employer-employee relationships, much less who was responsible for happiness in those. And in another very quick aside, I'd watched the very popular, internationally popular Downton Abbey show, which is incredibly addictive, I have to say. But I also found myself thinking and researching and reading a lot about the, again, this situation historically showing in in England, um, how if someone was not in the appropriate social class, they didn't have the same rights. And this idea that people lived upstairs and people lived downstairs, and that sort of the downstairs people weren't even really people. I mean, it's one thing to have somebody who says, "Oh, it's my business, and I'm a chef," or "It's my business, and I'm in the janitorial services," or "It's my business," or whatever, and that's what they do, and then they live their regular life. But it's another thing to have somebody who lives in your elaborate mansion downstairs, and you never. I mean, they're not even. They're not allowed. They don't look at you. You don't look at them. They don't speak to you. The way they're treated. I mean, again, very emotional. And then as I said, that got me thinking and researching, and I did a bit to read more about the large number of immigrants that left Europe and went to all different parts of the world in many instances, certainly to the U.S. and to Australia, to have a shot at being a full human and having equal rights and a chance at a different life, instead of, I was born into this is what I'll do my whole life, and I'll die this way. And I very, like I said, it's very emotional because I'm aware of these things, not as much as I should be, not as much as I could be, but I am aware of them. And I, again, find it to be so dishonest for someone who is in an employee-employee relationship, where they aren't property, where they're not an indentured servant, to tell me that they don't have the ability to be in charge and responsible for their own happiness. It's offensive. And if you've ever encountered someone who starts to give you this line of argument, maybe at your job, maybe you're having a nice day, and you run into one of these people, and you say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And they say, "Oh, how am I doing? What do you mean? I'm here. This job sucks. Place sucks. I hate our employer. They're horrible." Okay, look, here's the deal. That employer may be awesome, and they may be awful. You and I don't know what that individual person experiences at that job. You know what you experience, but it could be different. We don't know. All I'm saying is that they do have the right of contract if they're not owned property, if they haven't been put into one of these situations where they're deprived of their individual dignity and liberty. Then the fact that they do have options and they don't choose to exercise them, I find it to be offensive. Not that they should leave that second and walk out and get a bad reference and not get their last paycheck. That would be stupid on their part. I'm not saying to hurt themselves. I'm saying that they should start planning ahead. This is not the right place for me, for whatever reason, and maybe very valid reasons. This employer, it's not part of my world. That's bringing me toward surpassing my goals, and I'm not happy. It's hurting my happiness in the rest of my life. Okay, that's fine. We all have situations in life where that happens. It happens to me. It happens to you and everybody, where we're dealing with something and we realize, wait a minute, this situation. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a situation. It could be something that we're doing, a project. It could be a volunteer thing. It could be just a fun thing. And we realize, this isn't working. This is not working in terms of, being part of my happiness. So then we don't do that in the future. We don't go back to that restaurant if eating there didn't work for us. We don't go back to that social club. We don't hang out with those people again, right? And it's the same thing with work. When we realize this is something that's not working for us, and that this employer is not part of our overall, we're not getting contentment, we're not practicing the joyful art of business, that's awesome that we recognize it. When we take that information, then we start acting. We start getting our plan together, and we have so many different programs, and we're coming up and continuing to integrate new webinars and seminars, and I'm constantly thinking of different types of resources for our community members, so that you can then execute the plan to get out of that place, because it's not right for you, because it's not bringing you closer to your goals. Everything from your resume and interviewing, everything, we're putting together the whole resources available so the people can take that and use that then to get to a different employer. My point though is if you're really miserable and unhappy, often people forget that everywhere you go, there you are. Everywhere you go, there you are. So the challenge though is if somebody says, "Oh, this employer is horrible," and then you ask them specifically, "What's horrible about it?" Is something that I don't, something really, something happening I don't know about, or something, did they falsify the records? Are they not paying you? Is there some sort of, abuse or emotional, harassment or bullying? I mean, something could be really serious. But sometimes you'll talk to people, and this is a small percentage of people, and there's really nothing that employer has done or not done that's either illegal or unethical or anything like that. But when you start listening to the person, the stuff they complain about, it's just their own life. So if the person says, "Well, this place, I never thought this is where I'd end up in my life. I had big dreams. And this wasn't my dream." Okay, look, that's not anything that the employer has anything to do with. What your dream was before, where you want to be. And when you change employers it's not going to change it. It's not going to change the thing that's making you happy. You're unhappy that you don't want to do this thing at all. You don't want to be in this profession. You don't want to make this amount of money. You don't want to do any of this. Your fantasy and dream was you were going to be a professional, singer and be on stage around the world and people would buy your musical recording. And now you don't want to do anything but that. Well, then that means that changing employers won't make you any happier or at all, because you're going to be in the same position. And what I'm arguing is that, one, when people start telling you that, hey, this employer is the reason I'm unhappy, it's not true. Your employer isn't responsible for your happiness. That's not a myth. And the things that are making them unhappy, I want those things to be addressed so that they can move toward happiness. Not sheer bliss, not ecstasy every second of every day, but that more often than not, yeah, life's working for them. Because if they don't, you and I know, and we've talked about this, and we've had so many programs, and if you know anything about my personal life journey, we're fighting literally for our existence, individually and collectively. We have to create lives that we can sustain ourselves in. And being miserable and being in pain, and people get to a point where that pain is just unrelenting. And we're in real danger when those things happen. So the fact that someone's unhappy is really important. It's a flashing warning sign that we want to address. But the purpose of this program and some of the other companion shows that I've addressed is to help people understand that you're going down the wrong path to fix the quote problem. The problem isn't your employer. The problem is that there are other things you're unhappy about. So let's get to focusing on those and working on those, so that we could potentially get you in a different type of life, so that it is working and it is sustainable. And my fear and challenge is that the things that would need to be done to get somebody to a place where they can sustain themselves and hopefully eventually thrive, it's a lot of work, and it's much harder, and it's much more uncomfortable to look in the mirror and realize I'm the one that has to change stuff. It also it's more heavy lifting, because you got to figure out what it is, and then you got to go do things. It's much easier to sit somewhere with a lot less effort, the job that already exists, and all you have to do is just keep showing up and then complain about it. That's a lot easier, because you don't have to do anything really other than just show up and then get your check and then be unhappy and stuff. But the changes that have to be done to get somebody to a place where they're content and potentially happy at times is a lot more heavy lifting up front, on the front end. But the really cool thing is, though, once they do that, though, then it's their life. Life is much easier, right? Because you're okay with your employer, you're okay with how you feel about yourself, and all of a sudden life starts to start working for you. But when you're in a place where you start blaming these external entities, It's my employer is the reason I'm unhappy. My spouse is the reason I'm unhappy. My family is the reason I'm unhappy. My bad health is the reason I'm unhappy. Or, people have lists of stuff. My pet is the reason I'm unhappy. The traffic is the reason I'm happy. The city I live in is the reason I'm unhappy. The politician that don't even know that I saw something on, the internet about. They're the reason I'm unhappy. People just go on and on. People have groups, some ethnic group or some religious group or some sports team, or just people they can come up with just almost an endless list of different external entities to attribute the unhappiness to, and all of it is such a waste of energy because it's none of that. You and I are not property. And to me, that is something we should be appreciative of. Not to any individual entity, I'm not saying, but I'm saying as humans, with the history we have, to have moved where there's even a discussion and where it's an option in many parts of the world for different types of people. Women and men, people from different ethnic backgrounds, different religions. I feel something I'm personally grateful for. And I'm going to try, and I'm taking advantage of it. That's why I do these programs and I do my work. And I walk around in the world, as I said earlier. I'm out and about on the planet. I'm on boats and trains and planes, and I'm in Asia and Australia and Europe and Africa and North America and South America, and I'm out and about doing all this because I can. And I'm fully aware that might just be an accident of good fortune because I was in a different time period. I definitely wouldn't be able to do all these things. So I'm doing them. And I'm fully aware that unhappiness is, again, potentially, if it's untreated, something that can, destroy people's lives. And that's why we do so many of these programs. That's why we did this program today. If you're not happy, then that's really important to me. And as I said, we have so many different programs and resources, and reach out to me, and we will come up with a combination of whatever we need to do to get you the tools that you need, the information that you need, so that you can then start to implement these changes so that you are surpassing your goals and that you're practicing the joyful art of business. That's really important. But I want to dispel any type of fallacy that some external entity is the one that's to blame. It isn't. It's not your employer. Your employer is not responsible for your happiness. And I'm going to say this, I do programs for executives and managers exactly on the other side of this. Your employee is not responsible for your happiness. We talk about that. Because you hear all the time, people say, well, my team members, I don't really think that, they just don't, they don't seem like they care. And it's like they do care, but they're not responsible for your happiness. They just work here. They have their own lives, just like you're supposed to have your own life. And all these other relationships in life. I know people, adults who say, oh, my parents or my grandparents or whoever, some other older adult relative is responsible for my unhappiness or my happiness. And then there are adults who will say their children. Sometimes they'll say they're infant children. That's the reason they're unhappy. Really? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. But it doesn't make any sense that you say that, look, it's not your child, it's not your parent, it's not your spouse, it's not your neighbor, it's not your best friend, it's not somebody you saw on television or some group you read about on the internet or someone who lives in another part of the world or somebody who, has a different belief system than you do or somebody who looks differently than you do. It's not your boss, it's not the person who cut you off in traffic or the person who's mean to you on the metro. None of that. Now, all that stuff happens. We all have people who irritate us. We all have people that we realize we don't need to hang out with anymore. We all have people that we think, hey, like I said earlier, when we get that feeling like this isn't working, then not like we don't cut off things rudely. We don't do anything unprofessional, but we might realize, hey, I don't want to hang out with these people anymore. Or we're not going to have these types of conversations. Or I'm not going to put myself in this situation with this group. It's not going well for me. That you spending any of your time sitting around and attributing your emotional and psychological state of mind to other entities is completely useless. Because what could you do? Like I said a while ago, if this second line of reasoning that the employer was responsible was true, then you'd be doomed. You'd be doomed. And the thing, as I was saying, that was so emotional when we look at our human history, whether it was in Europe or Asia or Africa or Australia, the reason that so many of us are where we are in modern times is because someone in the past didn't accept that they never would get a different type of life. They didn't accept that their children would never have a different type of life. And they've made huge changes and sacrifices and took huge risks. People got on little. I went one time and I saw a scale replica of the ships that were used when people left Europe to go to the New World. And they were so tiny. I mean, I honestly didn't, I mean, I witnessed all this, and it was like a museum piece, and I was thinking, there's no way it was that small, and somebody would get on something that small, right? With no modern resources, right? No radar, sonar, no electricity. These little, teeny, little, tiny little things, and sort of just set off into literally the who knows where. Some people were motivated by potentially maybe finding riches, but I'll tell you, a lot of people and a lot of the narratives and the history shows us, as I mentioned earlier, the fictionalized show, that people left the old world because you couldn't do anything different. You were born into this, and this would be your whole life, and there's nothing you could do differently. And no people then, and then under all types of other circumstances, have not accepted that. And they took these changes, these risks and these chances for exactly what we have today: the ability to sit around and debate how happy you are with an employer relationship that you can leave or go. That's why they did it. And I respect it, and I'm grateful to all of the prices that people paid, so that today, and hopefully, and I'm hoping in the future, will continue to evolve, so that 5 generations from now, it's an even more wonderful world for people in terms of opportunity, in terms of freedom, in terms of equal value. And I just think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing for us as humans to celebrate and be proud of. But I also think we need to not disrespect that history by saying that in modern times, if you are in a legal employer-employee relationship, that your employer is the problem, that's why you're unhappy. That isn't. There may be things that at that place that are not working for you, but that means that you're supposed to be working then on all the programs we have about getting your skill set where it needs to be, about defining and determining exactly what the goal is, whether it's income, whether it's a type of work, whether you want to change fields, maybe whatever it is you want to do. Let's get the path and get working on that so we can do it. And I know that for many people, that's scarier than actually sitting around and complaining. But it's freeing. And all of our ancestors, and if we go back far enough, they made huge risks and took huge chances so that we could do more and be more. So do it. So to conclude here in show 208, I do again encourage you to come by CourtneyAnderson.com. I also ask you to leave a review or a rating if you find our show on iTunes or Stitcher or Libsyn or any of the those are distribution partners we have around the world. When you're on CourtneyAnderson.com, I ask you to stay and look around. We have as of now somewhere in the range of 600 pages of content for you. There's this program. There are video companion or television program shows. We're adding new articles and ebooks, and have upcoming webinars and seminars and courses. So please browse, bookmark us, come back, reach out and let me know if you have any feedback or show suggestions or ideas. It's all about you. This is your life. Your happiness is one of the goals that we are working on surpassing. But we need to get past this sticking point of thinking it's somebody else. It isn't. Your employer is just that. They were just an employer. You may be with them for the rest of your career. If it turns out that actually when you change some other things in your life, you realize you actually like that employer, it's better than you realize. Or it may turn out that, it's an employer that you don't even really remember that much about in the future because you've moved on to other bigger and better things. So that's where I want to go with you, to these better opportunities. But we need to disengage from these fantasies that it's some other entity that's responsible for our happiness, because it isn't. Our employer, your employer, isn't responsible for your happiness. Again, come by CourtneyAnderson.com. I'm also now on Twitter at Zealous Business. And if you see anything on CourtneyAnderson.com on any of the pages from our show sponsors, from our sponsor showcases, any links to a service or product you'd like to buy, please click on that on the site so we get credit for it. And again, you have a chance to define your happiness. So let's work together to make sure that we do that. Thank you.